Jan, thank you very much for those introductory comments, very kind. And thank you very much, everybody, for turning up on this October evening, and it's suddenly become October today, which is a bit of a shame. So this evening I'm going to give you a talk that's in approximately two halves. And the first part of the talk will really be me trying to tell you how I think about my discipline, which is nominally evolutionary psychology, but as Vakar's indicated, I think it's something a bit broader than that. And in a sense, that's to get everybody onto the same page in this mixed audience, but it's also so that some of my colleagues in the field can understand my errors of judgment and weaknesses in reasoning, and then they can harangue me later. And then I'm going to move on in the second part to talking about some empirical work that I've done with colleagues that kind of applies that view to a particular bunch of things that interest me. But before I do all that, I thought I'd do something else, and I've spent a long time thinking about what it is to give an inaugural lecture. It's quite a daunting task, and I've watched many inaugurals here and elsewhere and talked to various people who've done them and so on and so forth. And the long and the short of it is that there's no established social norm for what I should be doing. But there is one thing that does seem to stabilise, and that's some need to be biographical. And indeed, everybody I've spoken to has impressed upon me the need to introduce some biography. And this isn't something that particularly thrills me. My life has been momentously tedious, really. But I thought I'd try and do something along those lines just to get us warmed up. So the first fact you need to know about my life is that I am actually the fault of these two people who are sat here. Top person is Anne Dickins, who used to be Anne Carstairs before my father ruined her. And she had a career as a geologist and a physical geographer. And then my father, David Dickins, who taught at least two people in this room, as well as me and my brother in many ways, a zoologist and a psychologist. And he continues some 10 years after his retirement to research and publish okay papers, I feel. And they got together after a rather dull party in Ealing and begat me, an evolutionary psychologist. That's me there. The other fact you need to realise is that this organism, in a behavioural category I know not what, is also their fault. This is Ben Dickins, my younger brother by some 10 years, so they took a while to make another error. And he's now a molecular geneticist and with a strong interest in evolutionary matters, and he's recently taken up a lectureship at Nottingham Trent University after having been in Penn State for many years. So I feel that these two slides are almost sufficient evidence to launch the hypothesis that my disposition for evolutionary matters is in fact a product of my nature. Without the good mixing of these genes, this evolutionary psychologist and this molecular geneticist would not be. However, my father also had these objects lurking in various untidy piles, stuffed into bookcases and garages and cellars in the various properties we lived in around Merseyside. And I decided I would read them during my sort of later adolescence, really. I was either rock climbing or reading Dad's books. I wasn't particularly attending school as assiduously as I might, but don't use that as a model. And as a consequence of reading Dad's books, I got really very interested in biology and psychology, and also a little bit tainted by philosophy. He had some philosophy books knocking around. And so after messing up at least one A-level, I managed to make it through clearing into what was then the North East London Polytechnic to read psychology, much to my father's consternation, because I'd never consulted with him about this interest. I decided to read his available books, but not to talk to him. I wanted to make my own decision, be my own man. And off I went to NELP, as was. It's now, of course, the University of East London, where, as Vakar said, I worked for 9 years, which was a happy homecoming for me. NELP kind of saved me from my indolence and reduced my reading and increased my productivity a bit. But the other thing about NELP that I found extraordinary was that whilst I was wandering the halls, and at least two characters who taught me, I can see wondering what I'm going to say next, but you two do not fit into this category, Colin and Ernie, there were many people who seemed extremely uncertain how to relate the facts of sexual reproduction to the facts of reading. And this became something that I was interested in. How can you think about these two things? And I shall come right back to this at the end. So that's my biography. So I've been sort of tooling around in this field for a long time now, and in some senses 23 years, I think. And I've noticed a number of things about the discipline, and one of the things that I've noticed is that it suffers. And the discipline here, I mean psychology, more broadly the behavioural sciences, it suffers from a blight of oppositional dichotomies. So if you are ever to be a junior lecturer just starting out in your career, it's quite likely that at some point you will be asked to deliver a tutorial or a seminar or a lecture on the nature-nurture debate, which is a horrible thing to do to somebody. You might also be asked to discuss whether a particular trait or disposition is innate or the property of learning. Has it come about as a consequence of learning? And then perhaps a little bit more recently, there's been a reintroduction, if you like, into my particular corner of the field of this oppositional dichotomy, the distinction between plastic and robust traits. And all of these things and the reasoning associated with it troubled me. So I didn't want to do that teaching. So I thought I need a quick fix to make this go away when I'm confronted by students who have to do these things. So I would say things to them like this. Look, nurture is something that happens in nature. Don't worry about it. We'll go down the pub and talk about something more interesting. Learning is a product of learning mechanisms. So really the onus on the explanation is to account for the nature of those learning mechanisms without getting too carried away about the content of what is learned at this point. Just go down the pub again. And plasticity is one way of weathering the vicissitudes of life, and that's a definition of robustness. Maybe we should go and have a coffee now. So those are my quick fixes, and new colleagues can borrow those, and they're quite useful. But of course, they're also flippant, and I like flippancy. And one reason I like flippancy is because flippancy really, to work well, has to be predicated on some assumptions. It's born of assumptions. And those assumptions have got to really do some work for you. So it's a quick leverage into an idea. So the underlying assumptions for these kind of flippant comments to my students are kind of something like this. Nurture is something that happens in nature. So we're saying in a way that this is a kind of category error. Nature is this larger set, and nurture is a member of that set. It's a naturally occurring thing, nurturing behaviour and so forth. So it's actually philosophically a little bit of a problem, and we can talk about that perhaps with our students more seriously. Learning, as I say, is a product of learning mechanisms. They must at the very least include some innate properties in order to establish learning in the first instance, otherwise it wouldn't work. And more importantly, learning mechanisms also determine or constrain what is in fact learnt. If we just had some kind of free association between everything and everything else, we would know nothing, and it would be almost like perception rather than learning. It wouldn't even be that good, actually, for various reasons that many of you know. And then plasticity, as I say, is another way of weathering the vicissitudes of life. And again, this is a form of category error. It is a kind of robustness. It's not oppositional. So these are the actual assumptions underlying my cheap comments in tutorials. And assumptions, as I've said, are effectively theoretical objects. And theoretical objects deserve to be explored and to be excoriated. And if ever I have a motto carved across my front door, that's what it will be, to explore and to excoriate. That is how I see my objectives in life. It's a good job I'm not a medic. So because they are theoretical objects, I want to get into the detail of them, and my intuition tells me to kind of move away from oppositional dichotomy and towards unity. And in order to do this, I basically had to look around for a theory whilst I was learning the craft, and I came across a theory, and you'll probably figure out what that is from the title of my job. So that's what we need to talk about now, what I'm talking about when I'm using evolutionary ideas. One of the things about evolution, one of the great things about evolution as an area is that in some ways it's extremely straightforward to engage with it. It's a very straightforward set of ideas on the surface of evolutionary theory. But beneath that surface lie all kinds of conceptual tricks, all kinds of things that can cause you to make certain kinds of errors around causal reasoning and so forth. And those are the kind of things I worry about in some of my work. So I'm going to sort of give you a quick tour through how I think about it and then see where we get to. So the first thing to note when you talk about evolution is what you're actually talking about is, in fact, a kind of change. That's all evolution is. It's a kind of change. And this kind of change that has these properties, it admits of variation, competition, and inheritance. And the thing to note about that is that there are quite a few systems that actually enable evolutionary change, because quite a few systems have these properties. So a great example was put forward by Richard Webb in a paper in 2011, where he talked about the pharmaceutical industry kind of relying on evolutionary change. And the basic idea, to slightly foreshorten his argument, is that your task is to deliver a drug that will cure a particular disease. So you have a hypothesis-driven kind of process in this case, but you produce a number of drug variants that you think will deal with the disease. And then you run them through a competitive system, which will be some kind of experimental setup, an animal model, or more likely an artificial animal model these days. And you see which one of those variants deals with the disease better. And so that's the competitive element. And then you pluck out those ones that are more successful than others, and they get passed on to the next generation, so that's inheritance. And then you run them again through a competition, and eventually you winnow away or select away, and you find yourself with a drug that you can use. So that's an evolutionary system, but it's not really the kind of evolutionary system I'm interested in. And we have to be very careful to make detailed notes about the kind of system we're interested in before we recruit some kind of theory to talk about them. So you wouldn't want to apply the next theory that I'm about to talk about to that kind of evolutionary system, because the next theory, of course, is the one that most people assume you're talking about when you mention the word evolution, and that is, loosely speaking for this evening's purposes, biological evolution. More technically, we would talk about the modern synthesis now, which is the marriage of Darwinian ideas with Mendelian genetics through the good offices of population genetics that occurred through the 30s and into the 60s, and in some ways sort of ended in the early 80s, and is now very much the established paradigm for evolutionary biology. There are a few people who disagree with that, but they're just wrong, so we won't talk about them this evening. And the thing to remember about this kind of evolution, modern synthetic stuff, is that there are 4 key processes that we need to think about. And this makes this a special theory because we're dealing with a special system. So we mustn't overgeneralize from my pharmaceutical example or Richard's. There is selection and drift, and there is migration and mutation. And the first 2 of these sort genetic variation, and the second 2, migration and mutation, generate it. So immediately you will notice that I have given us a constraint on this system. We're talking about genes. And these are the things that are going to be introducing variation and passing that on, presumably in a competitive environment. And that, of course, is crucial to what I'm thinking about and what we all think about in this discipline. Why is that crucial? Well, really, not to put too fine a point on it, this is where the conceptual buck stops in any kind of meaningful biological explanation of the sort that we should be engaging with in the behavioural sciences. So why do I think this? Well, I've already said genes are inherited. Genes replicate through cell division and so forth, so you get copies of them made. And as my brother likes to say, genes have a near instructional role in the building of proteins, from which all else emerges, as far as we're concerned. And that near instructional role is, of course, incredibly important. This is an informational idea about genes. It's not the same thing as saying they're a blueprint, but it's saying it's an instruction that constrains subsequent development, about which more later. And of course, as I've suggested, mutation, for example, can introduce variation into genes, and those gene variants will then change the proteins, which will in turn affect the traits that those proteins contribute to. And those traits can fare more or less well in the bodies of those organisms as a consequence of how, to put it colloquially, how well they help the organism to survive and reproduce and thereby get more genes into the next generation. We'll come to that in just a second. But this is where everything starts in terms of thinking about biological organisation, and it enables us to think about how that biological organisation has changed over time. So, sorry, I just need to flip back in. So I gave you the 4 processes here, and people like myself and many folks in this room are, when we're doing sort of evolutionary psychology or more generally sort of behavioural biology, we are really most interested in selection as the process, which is kind of like what I said about the pharmaceutical industry. It's the survival and reproduction idea. And we're kind of most interested in mutation as the introduction of new variants into genes. But that does not mean that we ignore the other 2 processes. But what we're looking for are particular kinds of traits that have been produced as a consequence of mutation and selection that are favoured in this competitive environment, and those sorts of traits we call adaptations. And the heuristic view of an adaptation, the kind of easy one to use, and it's perfectly fine, particularly among friends, is that an adaptation is a trait that increases the chances of survival and reproduction. And of course, the underlying reasoning for that is that the genes that contribute to that trait are increasing in relative frequency within the gene pool and are kind of winning out, if you like, in this evolutionary dynamic. So it's a selection process, as I say. We can say with a little bit greater precision then that any trait that, as a consequence of selection, causes its underlying genes to increase in relative frequency is an adaptation, but that's a bit more of a mouthful. So most people tend to just go with the survival and reproduction, which is okay, but you have to be careful that you don't miss the reproduction bit when you're thinking about that, basically. So we're in behavioural biology and evolutionary psychology, we're really interested in trying to isolate adaptations, behavioural traits that have been through this kind of selection process that have led to their genes increasing in relative frequency. But this doesn't mean that what we have to do is, every time we think about a particular behaviour, isolate the component genes that build the appropriate part of the brain and so forth. That's not really quite the job for an evolutionary analysis. That's more the job for a behavioural geneticist and so forth. And the molecular genetic story is, of course, fascinating and complementary in many ways, but it's not what evolutionary accounts provide. We're kind of interested in how these adaptations might operate, if you like, for the organism within its general environment, and I'm going to specify what I mean about that in just a second. So a more straightforward way of saying that is that we're kind of interested in individuals and groups of individuals and how they might behave. We're not interested in much else, really. So we need some way of kind of modelling all of this, and there's a number of ways of doing this, but one standard way of thinking about this is to invoke the concept of fitness. And fitness is a concept, it's a modelling concept. It's not really technically an actual property of organisms, but you can act as if it is within certain constraints, and this will enable you to make all kinds of interesting predictions about the adapted value of a particular behaviour. And fitness really breaks down into this survival and reproduction story in a way, but there's two components to it. There's direct fitness, which is really a measure of how much reproduction you have in fact done. So every time you reproduce in a sexually reproducing organism, you get 50% of your genetic variance into that offspring. So that means that those particular variants are given an opportunity to increase in relative frequency. Doesn't mean they necessarily will, but you're giving them a chance. Indirect fitness, which is the reproductive success of your relatives. If my brother ever steps out of the lab, I can get some benefits from that because he shares genes with me. Remember that, Ben. And then inclusive fitness, which is the combination of direct and indirect fitness. And we kind of will look at an organism and make a kind of first pass assumption that the trait we might be looking at is possibly an adaptation, and if it is, then it will be acting to maximise the average lifetime inclusive fitness of the organism. So that doesn't mean that every time that behaviour is done, their fitness is maximised. But if they keep doing that behaviour over their lifetime, on average, it will increase their relative fitness, and that means it takes the gene frequencies with it. So, for example, this male blackbird is provisioning a nest. This was taken on Lundy in the summer this year. And that's parenting behaviour. Parenting behaviour is kind of good. So it's bringing some food to the nest. That food will contain nutrition and calories, and that will be an investment in the chicks. And those chicks contain genes, genetic variants in common, and so forth. But of course, it might be that that food is somehow distasteful to the chicks and they won't eat it, or perhaps isn't as nutritionally valuable as the male blackbird thinks because it might be an early parent, it might be its first brood, in which case that particular behaviour isn't. But if it keeps doing that, the idea is that on average, its fitness will be maximised. He did all right. I followed him for 2 weeks. So lurking in all of this are ideas around causation, really, and this is kind of what interests me as part of what I'm doing at the moment in my work. And the notion of causation I'm going to talk about belongs to Ernst Mayr in his classic paper in Science in 1961, which has been strangely rebuked recently. That's another discussion again. And the kind of explanation I've just given you about that blackbird really is, as I say, an explanation that relies on average lifetime inclusive fitness, and that's an ultimate explanation under his categorization. So another way of thinking about ultimate explanations, another example, we can ask the question, why do swallows migrate? And the basic explanation for why swallows migrate is because they're insectivores, they need to track food resource, and insects are kind of climate dependent, so they basically move around tracking the seasons, and that food has calories and nutrients in it that will, they can invest in somatic capital to increase survival, and also in their chicks to increase their reproduction. So it's clearly an adaptation. So that's a why question, why are they doing it? And ultimate explanations address those, and ultimate causation is really understood in terms of maximising inclusive fitness on the whole. There are some tweaks, but we won't get into that. Swallows do this behaviour by tracking changes in light and temperature. There's a whole bunch of quite sophisticated neurohormonal mechanisms that in fact do that in the brains of swallows and other migratory birds. And those accounts are accounts of how they do the behaviour. And we refer to those as proximate explanations. They're proximate mechanisms, proximate causes that actually deliver the behaviour for the swallow. And hopefully, as you can see, these two things are two sides of the same coin. They're complementary explanations. They're not the same kind of explanation in any sense. They do different jobs. And on average, the kind of work I do is more interested in the ultimate causation. We're trying to see if things are adaptations. Not so concerned about proximate accounts of how they do it, although that then becomes interesting later, as I hope I'll demonstrate in the final few slides. Okay, so that's kind of, if you like, a quick run through and those of you in the field will realise I've been slippy in places, but it's the basic idea. But I wanted to come to a fourth possible oppositional dichotomy that knocks around, and this is that between development and evolution. Are these two things to be seen as opposites to one another in some meaningful way? And of course, as you can see, that kind of idea, development versus evolution, is related to the oppositional dichotomies I started with at the beginning of the talk. There's a long argument to be had here. There's a long history. And at one stage, I thought I might just give you a lecture on the history of that. I thought better of it, about how to relate developmental processes to evolutionary processes, whether development, in some senses, recapitulates evolutionary processes as was once thought, and so on and so forth. But these kinds of confusions never really quite go away in the literature. And one of the reasons I think that happens is because development is clearly captures a set of processes. They're not so nicely defined as evolutionary change with variation, competition, and inheritance. They're a bit more messy than that. But they are processes of change across lifespan from conception to death that kind of show trait changes leading to some kind of adult end state, and then possibly it will also include stage deterioration from death. And so some people see that as equivalent to evolution, which is a process that, of course, achieves particular kind of traits as well. But the problem here is that, one, the evolutionary explanation is an explanation of ultimate causes. We're talking about selection of traits, selection of genes, basically, that will be driven forward in the way I've said, whereas developmental processes are intrinsic to the individual. And also, they are not merely characterised as growth in the individual. So, for example, this bluebell, photographed in Epping Forest earlier this spring, is like in one of many thousands of bluebells. You should all go there in May if you get a chance. It's beautiful. Growing up towards the light. And if you look around superficially, they all look like they're doing the same thing. But if you then go from patch to patch within the forest, you'll notice that some of them are longer and more etiolated and so forth than others. There's particular kinds of temperature effects and so forth that affect their overall developmental trajectory. And in fact, the shape and constituency of plants in more interesting ways than you can just observe by the eye alone. So the developmental processes seem to be capturing, if you like, information that's useful, or doing something at least, for these different bluebells in different patches of the forest. So it seems to be kind of some sort of local calibration. And when you see local calibration like that, you should really be thinking, okay, there's some kind of proximate process going on here, which is interesting, and that may well have some kind of ultimate account to be attached to it. But we must not conflate the two things. The developmental processes are proximate processes with an evolutionary story. And lots of people recently have been getting rather upset about this distinction, and I don't know why. So rather than talk about the upset, you can read my tedious papers on that. But the ones with Cassie are good, because Cassie helped me. is to get into this notion of calibration. So what do I actually mean by this? I've thrown that term out. It's been mentioned in the introduction by Backup. And to do this, we need to do a thought experiment. I'm not actually going to make you do this, don't worry. So the thought experiment is that imagine you have to build a robot that has to travel across this empty room from point A to point B. That's all it has to do, so its entire life's work will be achieved when it gets to point B. And so most people, when you do this in the longer version in class, will come up with some kind of representation like this: car chassis design, for example, 4 wheels, a motor driving the back wheels. You just switch it on, plonk it on at A, point it at B, and it delivers the function. In all honesty, it does deliver the function. It's not an exciting situation, but there it is, it's delivered. But then I can make things more unpleasant, and I can introduce moving three-dimensional objects that can be in different configurations in a fairly unpredictable way. It's still got the same task, but the robot's got to get from A to B. And it occurs that to most folks that you maybe need to redesign this robot or start from scratch. If it's an evolutionary process, you're bolting things on, but we're not doing evolution at the moment. So you might design something like this. So again, we've got a basic car chassis, but we've got a couple of differences. So one difference is that we've given individual drive to the back wheels, and then the second difference is that we've introduced an input system. This is crucial. And this input system is actually 2 paddles. So if you depress this left paddle, it will inhibit or stop the back right motor, and likewise if you depress this right paddle, it will inhibit or stop the left motor. So this can introduce movement into my organism, as far as I'm concerned. And so you can see how that movement will help, and the robot will eventually get around there. Those of you who like these things will realise there's a couple of design flaws in this, but you can get it to work. I built this out of that robot Lego for my students one year, and it eventually gets there, which is fine, because it doesn't have to be perfect. It's messy, but it's fine. But the key point about this is that we can now talk about this organism in a particular sort of semi-formal way, and we can basically come up with the constraints for a psychological theory of the working of this particular robot, which is understood in conditional terms. So we have rules. If P1, left centre input, then Q1 stop right wheels. If P2, right centre input, then Q2 stop left wheels. More colloquially, if you get a left centre input, then turn right, and so on. And so this conditional architecture describes the entirety of this robot's existence. That's it. That's what it's like to be a robot. And you can do exactly the same to bats, although Thomas Nagel won't thank me for saying so. And I'll leave you to think about that. So what can we note from this? Well, the first thing to note is that this is effectively now an informational system, where information is understood. It's not something that's out there to be grabbed, but something that's a functional consequence of the relationship between an input and the system. So it becomes informational once you have some kind of design thing there to deal with that input. And that's something that often, I think, gets lost in some descriptions and discussions of behaviour. The second thing, perhaps, to note is that my robot only takes input of a certain kind. So for the sake of argument, we call it tactile. It's not really through these depression paddles, and that's it. Now, it may well live in a room that's full of light, chemicals, has varying temperature, and so on and so forth. So potentially vast array of possible inputs, but it is not designed to take those inputs. It is only designed to take this pressure input through the paddles. And that means that it only knows that world in that way. More precisely, we can say that those inputs and the design that makes them informational effectively defines the robot's ecology. And this is an important distinction, I think. So the environment is everything that is without that robot, everything that's outside of it. Its ecology is the bit that it can functionally use as a consequence of its design. And of course, the backstory to this is that I believe that design is a consequence of selection of adaptations. So that's all life is that, okay? So this robot can deal with moment-to-moment change in its particular ecology. It can kind of get around these movable three-dimensional objects and eventually achieve its end task. We're not talking about fitness maximising for our robot. That's the kind of end task we're interested in for real organisms, if you like. We can say a few more things about this, that where there is a potential to have a broader ecological bandwidth, so where more complex niches, if you like, can be occupied by organisms, then you will, of course, see more mechanisms of this sort. that can take particular kinds of inputs and treat them informationally. And so complex ecologies effectively contain more variables, and of course how variables play out, because they're variables, it's a kind of probabilistic exercise, and probabilities can be attached to those changes. So my robot lives in an easy part of the world, where it just has to do this moment-to-moment change, but you can imagine that it might be useful to be able to calibrate to things that might be changing in the future. You might take a bet on particular variables changing, or using particular variables as cues for other things that are going to happen later on in life. So you might expect that developmental processes of the sort that I was loosely invoking to explain the differences in bluebells might track these key variables and calibrate adult performance in crucial ways as a consequence of the ecology, the ecological facts on the ground that an organism finds itself put into. And this is where life history theory comes in. This is one way of doing this. So life history theory, well, some people refer to this, I refer to this as a mid-level theory in evolutionary biology, and I'm not actually sure what that means. It's basically just evolutionary biology doing its job, and you're thinking about fitness maximising. You make a kind of a black box assumption that your organism is going to act to maximise its average lifetime increase of fitness, and you assume that this is done by making certain kinds of investments in a genetic future over development, which is understood, as I've said, from conception to death. Those things are important, as we will all find out. So decisions that you make now, in the here and now, can therefore impact negatively or positively on your future fitness. So kind of an intuitive way of thinking about that might be to imagine that you're an arboreal primate. You've been through a period of starvation, so we're going to talk about psychological kind of decision at this point. You come across a tree that's filled with green fruits, and you've got a dilemma. You've been through starvation, you're still in starvation, that's bad. So you could eat all of these green fruits, and that would shift you out of that dangerous zone. But of course, the green fruits are not as nutritionally and calorically as valuable as they're going to be in the future. And also, there's some cost associated with digesting unripe fruits. So it will take on some costs which may reduce that utility. So you might want to hold back and only eat a few to get you out of starvation, then come back when the fruit is ripe. So this is a trade-off between kind of current now behaviours and future behaviours. And the kind of decision you're looking at there is what we might term a psychological decision. The life history theory looks at calibrating decisions like this at that level, but all the way through physiological decisions through growth and development. And it's understood in terms of these kinds of trade-offs that I've been trying to capture with that example. So the classic work on this was originally done looking at clutch size, which is just simply the number of eggs that are laid in any one bout within any bird that you care to be interested in, really. This was a chicken that provided breakfast, so it's not really the kind of data we're looking at, but it was to get the point across. And the thing about eggs is that they represent a possible chick for the parent, and that means they're a fitness investment to the parent, because they will hopefully go on and reproduce themselves, and the genetic variants will pass on, and we'll get increases in frequency and so forth. So that's fine, but the trade-off is that producing eggs is energetically and nutritionally costly. And you can put more or less material into eggs. They can have richer yolks and so forth. And there's all kinds of other fancy things birds do with hormonal deposition and so forth. But again, that becomes techie quite fast. And then when they hatch, feeding chicks is costly too. You've got to divide the resource that you've captured across however many males you've managed to produce. And you can see that could be a diminishing situation for the adults. So David Lack, around 1947, key publications in 1947, thought about this in the kind of way that I've been discussing, and said, that, and this is more as a direct quote from him, the simplest hypothesis would be that natural selection will favour the clutch sizes that produce the most surviving offspring. So, put that another way, the probability of a given chick surviving will reduce as a linear function of the clutch size. The more chicks there are, the less likely that any chick will survive. And this was tested by manipulating clutches, adding more eggs to them, and indeed increasing eggs in clutches, seemed on average to reduce survival in a large number of cases. So that seemed initially to be support for Lack's hypothesis, and he was quite happy. However, sometime later, 1987, some 40 years later, Boyce and Perrins, and actually it was all around the mid-80s they published, but this was a classic paper of theirs, published the results of a very long-term 22-year study done on the great tits of Wyton Woods in Oxfordshire. And they've looked at almost 4,500 clutches in this overall study, which is a considerable feat of work for anybody who's ever tried doing this kind of stuff. And they found that the mean clutch size across 4,500 clutches was 8.53 eggs, clearly to mean. And then what they did was they calculated the average number of surviving offspring for each clutch size that they in fact observed, so the real clutch sizes, and they found that the number was highest when the clutch size was 12, which is odd, given that the mean is 8.53. So there seems to be some, at least some noise in the system. So they thought, okay, we've got to do some manipulation studies. They enlarged various clutches by 3 eggs. They also did reduction studies, but keeping this straightforward, and found that the most productive was still a clutch that had 12 eggs. So this means that these great tits could have been having more eggs in their clutch and producing more chicks that would survive and go on and reproduce. So this looks like a violation of Black's hypothesis. It looks like this is inhibiting fitness maximisation. But of course, Boyce and Perrins weren't foolish enough to say this means that natural selection and modern synthesis is wrong, because it would take downside more than this to deal with that. But what they did realise is that Black was making a number of key assumptions in his model. And those are the assumptions that we need to think about. So the first, the big one, and this is the one I'm going to focus on towards the end, is that he assumed there was no trade-off between current and future reproduction. So in other words, David Black was looking at the clutch as that was the total reproduction for any individual great tit pair that he was looking at. And of course, that's not in fact true. Most great tits will manage to get 2 broods out in a season, sometimes 3 if climate change continues, and which is not a good thing. And they have more than 1 breeding year. I think they start in about their first or second year, usually the second, I think. And they can go on for a number of years. The oldest recorded great tit, something to aspire to, was 14 years of age. Normally they sort of live about 6 years or so, but there's clearly quite a lot of reproductive potential in there. So it may well be that they're having to trade off what they can put into this current clutch and holding back some stuff for future clutches in the same breeding season, but also future breeding seasons. That decision will probably be physiological. They don't have a discussion. I once had a student ask me about the kinds of qualitative analysis we could do with swallows in terms of how they were allocating feeding to their offspring, which that was a hard lecture. The second assumption is that Black has assumed that the only effect of clutch size is upon whether the chicks survive or not. And in fact, there could be another trade-off going on here, which is a quality-quantity trade-off. So it may well be that you can have 12 chicks, but you have to put all that food across those 12 mouths. It might not be equally distributed, but you're distributing it in some way. That means you may actually produce slightly weedy chicks that will go on to be slightly weedy adults, and perhaps won't be so competitive in the reproductive ecology and will breed less, or might not even make it to reproduce because they don't have sufficient resources to weather the winter and so forth. And various other things can happen to you. So you might be better off holding back and having fewer, but having really robust chicks that can weather the vicissitudes of life. And then thirdly, it's possible that birds vary in all kinds of other ways in their reproductive biology. So you can introduce various kinds of individual difference variables which might have messed up the data. But that's less important. The broad evolutionary lessons come from points 1 and 2. So it's this trade-off between current versus future reproduction that I've been interested in, thanks to Aubrey, who sat here. He got me started on all this with a conversation over a glass of nice wine in Tottenham Park, I think it was, and suggested that we think about this in human populations. And so with Daniel Neffel and other colleagues, I've been working on this in recent years, and I thought I'd talk to you about this for the remainder of the rally. So there's been a long association in the literature between socioeconomic variables and early pregnancy in Western humans. There is also, of course, a set of similar relationships in developing world countries, but they become slightly more complex. But I'm happy to talk about that over a drink afterwards. The thing that's of interest to us is that socioeconomic variables are basically measures of key ecological variables. They're the kind of things that ought to be important to these organisms, the kind of thing they ought to be designed to be tracking as they develop. So one of the things that comes from epidemiology and related disciplines is that, particularly in areas where you have large relative inequality, But those in the worst of neighbourhoods, the lowest socioeconomic status neighbourhoods, tend to have earlier morbidity, particular kinds, and earlier mortality. And what we would say in my field is that they have a faster life history. So you can have fast or slow life history, so you can spend a long time developing, building robust bodies, delaying reproduction until later, and then investing in those, and quite often there's lots of quality investment in those kinds of strategies. And then you might invest postpartum in particular species, and so forth. Or you can kind of just get on with it, grow as quickly as you can, the essential reproductive equipment that you need, reproduce, and then die. And those differences can be seen between species, but also within species, as they are living in particular ecological niches. So, given that, we should expect, just as a sort of starting point, to see differences in calibration, developmental calibration, across socioeconomic strata. And arguably that's what the epidemiological data already shows us. We can interpret that in many ways, but it's also good to quest for particular effects in order to make sure that you're not just engaged in a long description. So that's kind of what we've been doing. And one way we've been doing it is to look at the data set, the National Child Development Study, which many of you, I'm sure, have counted. It basically tracks all the children born in the UK and Great Britain in the first week of March 1958. So it started off with a sample size of 17,500. That's dropped off over the years. I'll just give you the 2004 data to give you a sense of that. And that dropping off hasn't been a nice linear decline. It's been a kind of fluctuating thing. Some of it's due to mortality and morbidity, but some of it's due to people just dropping out through lack of interest. But nonetheless, we're still left with a very healthy sample. And the people running this have collected all kinds of measures, behavioural measures, psychological measures more traditionally understood, and wet biological measures and so forth. So lots of data in there to explore. There's a sort of caveat here, which is the problem with secondary data analysis of this sort is that they never quite collect the data as you would like them to. And it's not always easy to get in and ask people to measure the things we'd like them to. So this has to be taken with a pinch of salt to some extent, but I'll perhaps say something about that to the end. The main questions that we ask really are, is there, at the psychological level, very uncomfortable psychology is this one, as you're probably picking up, but so I'm not quite sure what it is. But the sort of intentional level, if you like, is there any intention to reproduce early in girls, as there will be at this stage, from particular kinds of environments, ecologies more precisely? And how does that actually cash out? Is there any kind of buy-in from that intention? What, other than this, best predicts early pregnancy? Obviously that's the most important thing. And do these girls develop differently compared to matched controls? So one key thing to note is that you can't just go to a poor area and assume that all the girls are going to be teenage mothers. That isn't the case, although Daily Mail think it is. It's actually because there's still a minority of girls, and so what's interesting is why these particular girls are going as early as they do. So that's really what we're kind of interested in. And in another part of what I've been doing with other colleagues, with their policy implications, as you might imagine, for all of this. So I'm just going to take you through some of the data that we've done, and then I'll release you. This is looking at menarche, so when girls first start to menstruate, in a matched control design. So this is the cases of the girls who become teenage mothers, and we mean they become mothers before 20. We messed around with this, lowering the age to 18, and you get exactly the same result. So we decided to stick with 20 as non-teenagers and 19 and below as teenagers, just to keep it actually teenagers. So that they become teenage mothers, and then the controls are matched controls from the same socioeconomic position. And you can see here that we have a significantly earlier onset of menarche in these girls who go on to become teenage mothers. Now, if you look at that, it's only a matter of about half a year, if that. But biologically, you can get quite a lot of business done in half a year. So that's not insignificant. The reason we're interested in this is because some other variables that have been associated with teenage pregnancy have been seen to predict early menarche, but nobody's actually joined up the dots, and that's what we've tried to do with this study. So first of all, we needed to know if that was happening. It's worth also noting that their menarche will be considerably earlier than girls in the higher socioeconomic strata. This is a bit of development, and so here we have two measures being taken. So from birth, at various stages through to 23 years of age. That's all we're interested in at the moment because 20s are cut off. And you can see on the top line you've got weight, and the middle and then the bottom line, so the open squares is weight and the bottom filled diamonds are is height. And then this middle line, straight across the 0, is the normalised means and standard deviations for the matched control group. And so we're looking at how the cases differ from the matched control group in this particular graph. The weight is significantly different at birth from the matched controls. And we also know from separate analyses that one of the big predictors from within the same data set of early pregnancy is to have a low birth weight for gestational age. This is a key predictor. And that kind of indicates that you've been through a particular kind of gestational situation where you're getting particular kinds of inputs from the mother's placenta, which are nutritional, calorific inputs, but also stress inputs and so forth, which may well lead to particular kinds of investment just in crucial organs rather than particularly heavy baby. These are not premature babies, they're just light for gestational age. However, the rest of that weight pattern isn't significant beyond 7 in terms of its difference, but it is interesting to note the pattern because that sort of kind of weight gain that you see is indicative of various kinds of morbidity that are more prevalent in those particular populations. The height is different all the way through. They are shorter, these teenage mothers. Okay, so there's some growth data there. This is a kind of cumulative effect graph. I mentioned the menarche effects that have been known. It's been well documented by Belsky and colleagues from the late 80s, in fact, that the absence of a father will lead to early menarche in populations. And they've got a couple of accounts why this might be. Obviously, not having a father involved in investment at least kind of could halve the investment that goes into offspring, so it'll change developmental trajectories. It's also indicative of the kind of reproductive ecology that you're likely to enter into, and that can have all kinds of physiological effects, probably mediated through stress hormones. This is Belsky's work. And we indeed found separately that father absence predicted this. So we wanted to combine this with the birth weight data. So we came up with these sort of dummy variables where you've got high birth weight, involved father, low birth weight, involved father, high birth weight, uninvolved father, and low birth weight, and an uninvolved father. And uninvolved, 99% of the time they're just not there at all. Occasionally some of them just turn up, but that's basically they're never there. And you can see that the odds ratios for early reproduction before 20 are increasing significantly as you go along that line. So these, there seems to be some kind of notion of cumulative risk here. These kinds of exposures happen. Okay, that's enough of that. I said we were interested in the intentions. This is going back to match control stuff again. Girls were asked at the age of 16, you have to remember the historical period that they were 16 in, what's the ideal age for first marriage? First, not even been asked, so the kind of world we now live in. Ideal age for marriage, and you can see there's a significant difference there. Again, on the left, it is the cases, and then these are the match controls. So they say they want to get married earlier, and they also say they want to start their family significantly earlier than these folks. If you cash that out in terms of what they actually do, so along the line here you have intended reproduction at age 16, you're going to have a kid at 16 or 17, 18 or 19 and so forth, and it's the actual age of first pregnancy. You see we have a nice relationship here. They are going later than they predict, but relatively they're going earlier along that line. This is sample size noise, because they were asked at 16, they said, oh yeah, now. And then we just do it often. So this gives you some indication that intentions are actually leading to particular kinds of behaviours. So we've got these physiological, developmental things going on, but also an interest in reproduction and starting families. And various other studies, including a big report done by Joseph Rowntree Foundation a few years ago, show lots of data for these teenagers actually planning their pregnancies and being in very stable partnerships and so forth. So it's not as if this is the land that the Daily Mail should forget. Don't like Daily Mail. So this is some psychological data. This is from the Bristol Social Adjustment Guides to subscales. So you have all the behaviours down here. And this is data that was collected by teachers in the classroom for these girls in the NCDS. And what we're looking at here is their odds relative to the matched control group. So this means that their odds here for forthcomingness are significantly increased if they're a teenage mother relative to the matched control at age 7 and at age 11. I won't go through all of these, but you can see that high odds for being depressed, and they increase just as they're about to enter into menarche. And various other things like restlessness suddenly kicks in around that period, hostility to other children, and various anxiety measures only kick in around this kind of basically puberty sort of time. These behaviours are ways of categorising particular kind of stress responses that aren't too dissimilar, cautious about this, but the sort of things you might use in looking for conduct disorder, which still persists in DSM-5, I believe. The basic idea we think here is that this is indicative of some kind of disjunction with the normal sort of social commerce of the more general socioeconomic strata that they're living in. So they're stressed, in other words. So to summarise then, we're basically saying this is strong evidence for, but it's in no sense conclusive, some kind of developmental calibration going on, which we can interpret in terms of fitness maximising because it's about reproduction, that's as good as it gets. These teenage mums are born lighter, the growth pattern is a little different, they reach menarche sooner, they tend to reproduce earlier and marry sooner than they do reproduce earlier. Their particular psychological response is indicative of stress. They have less to no paternal investment. And of course, they're socioeconomically challenged. All these things, when you partition them out from max control, are socioeconomically mediated. This is a huge factor in this. So, if you imagine being a small growing fetus in a uterus, I ask you to imagine that on this Thursday evening, you will get crucial kind of inputs that are telling you that life's not going to be that great when you pop out. But you could, of course, come into a situation where suddenly there is a new dad around, there are more resources, and nutrition might be changed as a consequence of that, and various other things could happen to shift out of the neighbourhood. There's a sort of possibility, we think, and this is me speculating now, of a developmental window there where you could recalibrate these organisms to later reproduction and a different kind of fitness trajectory. There's no value driven in any of this. Fitness maximising is just fitness maximising, but there are ways in which these things might be effective. So you could update your Bayesian prior, basically, if you have a Bayesian model. Some people who researched the video now realise what I was thinking about this. But of course, if your update tells you, no, actually it's worse or it's just the same, then you will carry on with that fast life history trajectory, grow smaller and get on with it, which in evolutionary terms is the most rational response you can make. And that's something that's lost for policymakers. Okay, so this is kind of how I see things then, to sort of wrap up. Organisms, it's not just teenage mums I'm interested in birds, as you might have picked up, and so forth. They're stuffed full of proximate mechanisms that basically gather inputs and use them informationally in this way. That's basically what life is, as I've suggested. And they use these inputs to calibrate themselves to maximise fitness, which is the utility that we're after. And this can be broken down into different kinds of timescales. Crudely speaking, we can talk about the moment-to-moment, sort of reflex-like responses, if you like, that I put into my robot. We can talk about learning, which is something I haven't really discussed, but of course learning is a crucial calibrational device. And we can talk about development, which is a different kind of timescale again. And of course this learning thing explains why how you can relate sexual reproduction to reading. You can be bequeathed the right kinds of genes that will dispositionally push you towards evolutionary theory. My brother and I were. But you need to be calibrated by the right kind of library ecology in order to continue discipline. And that's how you relate them. So now we can take that back to UEL and change the curriculum. I think there's all kinds of interesting things to be thinking about here. The ecological niche exploited can become more complex as selection puts in more input systems, allows more subtle calibrations. All kinds of interesting conditional calibrations can happen around thresholds and so forth. There's been much discussion about epigenetic marks in the literature recently. Some people making that conflation, thinking that epigenetic change across generations is equivalent to evolutionary change. It isn't. It's, again, a kind of proximate mechanism that allows calibration at the gene expression level. And not all organisms have epigenetic capabilities. They don't have those proximate mechanisms. And that suggests there's something ecologically specific about this that we need to say. And then you can look at this neurally, if you like. There are different investments in neural tissue for different tasks within an organism, but also across species you see extraordinary cooperation in bees and in humans with completely different neural decisions made how to do that, which is intriguing at the very least. So my general view is it's this kind of mapping of ecology to calibrational mechanisms that is really the most worthwhile project for the behavioural sciences, and something that I'm hoping to continue working on, but only when you understand calibration in terms of fitness maximisation. If If you lose that crucial utility, you'll lose track of what's going on in its entirety. So, glad to see that slide, I'm sure. Obviously, I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. It's been very kind of you to come out on this actually October evening. And I'd also like to thank Middlesex University for employing me, actually, because I think it's been very kind of them. And it's been fantastic to come here. I've had a great year. And as it was expressed, it's buzzing in psychology. There's a lot of great colleagues who are all new to me. And I'm really delighted to be here, which is not to say that I've abandoned my love for my former UEL colleagues. I still love them. But it's been nice to be revivified, to be recalibrated, really, by this new ecology. Science itself is a calibrational process. You're trying to calibrate learning, and the organism, of course, is made up by different organs, all of which are individual scientists. Nothing that I have done in my life or that I've talked about today could have been achieved without my collaborators, and there's a list of some of the recent ones here. And some of the papers I've been talking from indicate that I've been collaborating closely with a number of individuals. So this really is just a team effort, which is why biography in inaugural is tremendously tedious. It's not really about me, it's about what we've all produced together. And finally, of course, I must thank my mum and dad for that dull party they attended in the evening. That's very gracious of you. And finally, my wife, Nikki, for actually thoroughly recalibrating me and making me a better organism, I hope. Thank you very much.